I know many people in this room, probably everybody who's in the room with us here today, has watched, with hope, with great interest, with awe, at what has gone on around the world. The New York Times has dubbed this the year of the protest, from Kazakhstan to Algeria to Sudan to Nicaragua to Hong Kong. It's been truly amazing. And it's heartening to see that even as we're so concerned about the rise of authoritarianism, but so too is the number of people who are taking to the streets to raise their voice and demand greater accountability, less corruption, more responsiveness from their governments. And we know that as inspiring as these movements are, these very courageous citizens need support. They need space to resolve the conflicts and to accomplish their goals. Our nonviolent action program supports activists in peace building in some of these very tough environments, from Nicaragua to Venezuela, Afghanistan, by providing trainings on strategic planning and integrating dialogue and direct action. And this is seen especially through our guide on synergizing nonviolent action and peace building, happily known as the SNAP guide, S-N-A-P. You can find the SNAP guide online, and I highly encourage you to check it out and share it with your networks. And Maria may be able to say more about that. The name alone is worth the look. SNAP. So the report that we're going to discuss, Preventing Mass Atrocities, does two very important things. It reaffirms existing research on the efficacy of nonviolent resistance, and USIP's director, Maria Stefan, co-authored a study that examined 323 major violent and nonviolent campaigns from 1900 to 2006, and found that nonviolent campaigns were twice as successful at achieving their goals as armed insurgencies. Twice as successful. Secondly, this report offers practical guidance for how the international community can best support movements without undermining their legitimacy, their safety, or their agency. So I know this will be an amazing conversation. We have an extraordinary panel to talk about these issues with us today. And to kick us off, I'm delighted to turn things over to the co-author of this report, the president of ICNC, somebody who brings more than 15 years of experience in the field of civil resistance to this conversation, and a wonderful friend and partner, Hardy Merriman.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nancy.
Great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy. The feeling is mutual. It's great to be able to collaborate and partner with USIP, not just today, but in the future. Thank you. Thanks to the panelists. Thank you to all of you for coming out on this rainy day. And so as Nancy said, since 2002, I've focused on nonviolent civil resistance movements around the world that are fighting for rights, freedom, and justice. I take a social science approach to these movements, trying to figure out in the most basic terms, why do some movements succeed and why do others fail? And in particular, I emphasize, and my organization, the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, emphasizes the role of strategy and skills. What kind of strategies are effective and what kinds of skills are needed for ordinary people who are facing oppression to unify themselves, to organize, and to wage civil resistance and win against unaccountable political systems. So today, I want to talk about external support to these kinds of movements, to civil resistance movements, and discuss this new international doctrine that Peter Ackerman and I are proposing called a right to assist, or the short version is R2A. So the right to assist is a framework that would guide collaboration and international support to civil resistance movements that meet certain criteria around the world. It's not just any movement, and we'll get into that. Peter and I designed R2A in a way that is designed to engage a wide array of international actors. So it's not just a state-centric model. It's a model that would engage NGOs, yes states, multilaterals, diaspora groups, and a whole range of external actors to be supportive of nonviolent human rights movements. The goal is to incentivize the choice of nonviolent civil resistance when groups decide to rise up and demand their rights and support that choice. And we argue that if we can incentivize and support that choice, we can reduce the probability of violent conflict and therefore reduce the probability of atrocities. So my presentation today has 4 parts. Let's see. Great, the clicker works. So the first is to define my terms real briefly. What is civil resistance? What do I mean when I say that? Then talk a bit about why civil resistance matters. There has been a huge growth of research about the dynamics and impacts and outcomes of civil resistance movements around the world. In no small part with Maria Stephan, who's sitting right there, as one of the prime researchers. And particularly the quantitative research has been very important over the last 10 years. We can make all kinds of claims now that we used to feel strongly about and now have data to support. So the right to assist argument that I'm going to make to you today draws on a lot of literature and research that really is just new and exciting, and I think we're still grappling with what the implications are, and this is one attempt to get to that. So then I want to talk about external assistance itself and give a 5-part typology of different forms of external support, ranging from very sort of low threshold, indirect, not very interventionist support, to progressively more targeted interventionist and challenging support. And then Peter and I felt strongly that if we're talking about external assistance, we really need to scrutinize our own ideas about this, our own assumptions. And so actually, if you take a look at this special report, about a third of it is us responding to possible points that people might raise of saying, well, what about this? Because we have to be really careful. As external actors, we all know that even good intentions can lead to negative outcomes. So we are sort of offering this out as something for people to consider. We really welcome your comments, critiques, ideas, feedback. And we're hoping that people will run with this and want to take this, add their research to it, add their ideas to it, and slowly start to develop a normative framework or actually a full international doctrine around support to these movements. So what is civil resistance? So I'm going to bet that the first image that comes to your mind when I say that is starts with P, protest, right? Masses of people. It is the most common image. This is an image from Algeria earlier in the year, where they, through nonviolent means, forced a political transition against a president who had run the country for 20 years. So this is very common. There are different variations of the protest image. There's a large group of people. There's the close-up. There's focusing on a point of contention. But they all give the idea of mass, people at least saying no to something and possibly demanding something new. But that by itself is not civil resistance. That's generally what the media portrays mostly. But here's another image of civil resistance. Where do you think this was taken? This was taken in Khartoum in June of this year. And here, this is an incredibly powerful act of civil resistance. It's a general strike. Repression was so severe, people said, we're not going to mass, we're actually going to stay home. So if we want to get to a definition of civil resistance, we need a definition that can bridge the protest, the strike, and a lot of things in between. So here's just a basic definition. Civil resistance is a way for people, often ordinary people who don't have any special power or status or privilege, to wield power without using violence. And it consists of 3 kinds of acts. The first is acts of commission, where people do things that they're not supposed to do, not expected to do, or forbidden from doing. Protest when you're not supposed to protest. Sing a song when you're not supposed to sing a song. Wear a certain color. Use certain symbols. Create new social or economic or political behaviors that are not expected or that are forbidden. Right? There are lots and lots of ways we can do things we're not supposed to do. Right? We can just think about all the rules in our lives, written and unwritten, and then each of those represents a possible point of disobedience. Civil resistance includes the opposite, acts of omission, where people don't do things that they're supposed to do or required to do. So refusing to pay taxes, not not showing up for work, working slow, school boycotts, not paying utility bills, boycotts, choosing to change buying patterns, lots and lots of ways we can omit our conventional obedience patterns. And then a combination of both. So this would be, for example, creating alternative governance systems, alternative educational systems, alternative economic systems, which some movements have done. That's both an act of omission and commission. So it's a simple definition. And just one other point, and then I'll move on, is violence here is construed in a narrow sense of actually doing physical harm or threatening to do physical harm. So if an action is threatening to do physical harm or doing physical harm, it would not be civil resistance. Okay, so with that, people generally tend to do civil resistance when the conventional means of making change are not working, right? If they could change things using elections, they might do that. It's a lot easier. If they could change it just by petitioning the legal system and they had the capacity and access to do that, they would probably do that. But civil resistance is a response generally to truly unaccountable actions taken by power holders where the institutional means of changing that are failing. And so around the world, it's not surprising that as authoritarianism rises, we're seeing a lot more movements to challenge that authoritarianism, whether it's on grounds of corruption, people want democracy, people want rights, or a whole range of other issues. So why does civil resistance matter? I'll give you 4 reasons, all backed by data. The first is that it's powerful, right? So for those of you who are familiar with this book, of which Maria Stephan is a co-author, Nancy mentioned that Maria examined with Erica Chenoweth over 300 nonviolent and violent movements over the last century. And the core finding was that the nonviolent movements that were trying to get a political transition were twice as effective, 53% success rate, versus the violent ones, which had a 26% success rate. So a 2-to-1 differential in terms of success of nonviolent movements versus violent movements. And this is obviously a surprising finding, right? Because the conventional assumption is that violence is the means of last resort. Violence is the strongest thing. Violence is what people should do when everything else is failing. And yet, over hundreds of cases over the last century, we see a huge difference in the success rate of popular nonviolent and violent movements, even against powerful authoritarian governments. In addition, the average nonviolent campaign was found to last only 3 years. The average violent campaign was found to last 9 years. So some might argue that violence is more power. It may not be as effective, but it's faster. And the data completely rebuts that claim. Nonviolent movements take, on average, 3 years, which is a long time if you expect to be successful in 3 to 6 months, right? 3 years is still a long time, but it's a lot shorter than the alternative. So another reason why civil resistance matters is that it's a driver of democratic development. And this is one of the most replicated findings in the literature now. It's been replicated 7 or 8 times, where consistently people look with different methodologies at the relationship between nonviolent movements and democratic development, and they consistently find a very strong relationship. So just as one graph, this is drawing from Chenoweth and Stephan's work. They looked 5 years after you have a nonviolent movement that succeeds, that gets a political transition, what happens? And they found a 57% success rate. So 57% of the time, nonviolent movement yielded a democratic outcome. It's not 100%, right? 43% of the time it didn't. I'm sure we can all think of cases where it didn't. But it's pretty remarkable when you compare it to the prospects of violence, for example, which produced a democratic outcome 6% of the time. Another study done by Freedom House and also with Peter Ackerman looked at also top-down transitions that did not have a nonviolent resistance component, just negotiated round-table transitions. They resulted in a, quote, free society 14% of the time between the 70s and 2005. So as a comparative matter, civil resistance has proven consistently to be one of the most effective ways to get out of authoritarianism. Interestingly enough, even when nonviolent campaigns have failed, they sometimes lead to a democratic outcome. 5 years after a campaign failed, that's the figure on the to your right, there was still 35% of the time a democratic outcome. So there's something in nonviolent resistance, nonviolent civil resistance, that has a democratizing impact, even if a movement's immediate goals aren't achieved. A third reason, and this starts to get to the atrocity prevention and violence prevention piece. Civil resistance movements are significantly less likely to lead to mass killings in civil war than violent insurrection. So I'm going to talk about right to assist in a minute, but my colleague Peter Ackerman and I, who co-authored this report, have been talking about right to assist for a long time. And last year, there was a remarkable finding about nonviolent movements and their probability that a mass killing will happen that propelled us to say, okay, now's the time to write this. We have the data that we need. So Erica Chenoweth looked at basically what's the general probability that you will have a mass killing when there's a national uprising. It's just the generic probability, okay? Whether the uprising is violent or nonviolent, forget about that for a second. And so what she found with Evan Prokosky, her co-researcher, was that an uprising generically had a 43% chance of yielding a mass killing event. And a mass killing is basically 1,000 civilians killed in a single continuous event. It's basically an intentional targeting of a large number of civilians at one time, right? 43% of the time that happens. And it makes sense because the literature on mass killings tell us that instability plus a threat to a government makes a government more likely to respond in this way. But then the researchers looked, well, let's see if the driver of instability is nonviolent or violent. Let's see if that changes. And it changed it amazingly. They found that when a nonviolent campaign was challenging a government, there was only a 23% chance of a mass killing. When a violent campaign was challenging a government, the probability of a mass killing was 3 times as high. And this is really interesting because actually the nonviolent campaign is more threatening to the government, has a greater chance of creating a transition than the violent one, and still, governments are much less likely to use to do these kinds of killings and atrocities against nonviolent movements. Similarly, the probability of civil war. If you look 10 years after a nonviolent campaign, there was a 28% probability of civil war. This is based on over 300 cases over the last century. A 28% chance of civil war, which we're the results of which we're seeing now. For example, there's the civil war in Syria or in Yemen, is a really high. It's an uncomfortably high percentage, right? I mean, we shouldn't feel good. Oh, that country, it only has a 28% chance of resulting in civil war is scary. However, when we compare it to a violent campaign, the chance of civil war within 10 years of a violent campaign or uprising is 43%. So if people are going to rise up anyway, and I'll get to this in a second, because in general, sooner or later under authoritarian regimes, people do try to rise up. Shouldn't they be incentivized to choose a method that has a greater probability of a constructive outcome and a lower probability of devolving into civil war, mass killings, and so forth? And I would add as well, there may be things external actors can do to drive that 28% down. Okay, last part of our literature review, and then I'll get into right to assist. So the data also tells us that civil resistance has proven remarkably effective even in highly challenging circumstances. So one common refrain we might hear is that, well, nonviolent civil resistance can only work when there's a government that's not as brutal, or in a society that is not fractured ethnically, or when there's a certain level of economic development, or when the movement is supported by outsiders, or powerful countries like the United States, or when the regime itself is very powerful and big. So these have actually been tested in a growing body of research that says, okay, so let's control for that condition. Let's control for regime type and regime brutality and see if it relates to movement emergence and outcomes. And what we're finding remarkably is that it doesn't. It doesn't. Of the 6 factors I listed there, the one that is found to be significant is use of violent repression. And use of violent repression against a nonviolent movement is found to reduce its chance of success by 35%. 35% seems like a big number. It is a big number. But the conventional view is that if violence is used against a nonviolent movement, it's 100% effective, right? But that's not the case. It's 35%. So when we look, for example, at the movement in Sudan, that over months and months has so far transformed one of the most brutal governments of the last 30 years, and a government that used a great deal of repression, the repression was not enough to stop that movement. And so this is grounds for hope. So if these conditions don't determine a movement's outcome by themselves, then it must, what we see is that skills, strategic choices of movements matter. Yes, repression might be used, but the question is, what's the movement's counter strategy to it? In Sudan, one thing was a stay-at-home strike, and it worked pretty well. So there's an interaction between the conditions a movement faces and the strategies and skills that it meets those and how it overcomes or transforms them. Okay. So the premise of the right to assist, just to sort of summarize, is that dictators are often challenged by their populations at some point, right? So instability is inherent in authoritarian regimes. An authoritarian may look stable at the outside, but how do they generally fall? Generally, they're challenged by their own populations, not always, but often. So we can see Sudan earlier in this year looked stable, 30 years of the same government, but wasn't. We can look at Algeria earlier this year. We can look at Russia, where this picture was taken in August, where 60,000 people showed up in Moscow just to contest local elections when they were being thrown by the government. We can see Burkina Faso in 2015, transition there. We can see Tunisia, Egypt, Syria. Again, there's no guarantee that rising up nonviolently is going to yield the best outcome. Egypt has obviously struggled enormously. In Syria, there was 6 months of nonviolent, depending on how you count, primarily nonviolent resistance that then succumbed to armed struggle. Thus, we have this risk of civil war. But all of these governments, one could claim, seemed stable at the outset, and yet people rose up. And so when we look at the map of the world now, my question is, where else will people rise up? And when they do, is the international community, whether we put on our NGO hat, our policy and government hat, multilateral hat, or others, prepared for this? Can we incentivize it? Are there things we can do to support it to avert outcomes like what we saw in Syria? So, if people are going to rise up against governments eventually, we know how they do that has major repercussions. For mass killings, for civil war. One brief stat I didn't mention to you is that 2/3 of atrocities occur during civil wars. And so Peter and I developed this document around the right to assist. And so it is, as I said, sort of a proposed international doctrine. But right now, it is simply a document that you have. And you can think about this in a few different ways for it to be useful. The first is that what's in here, you can see it as just a set of common principles that you could read about and apply to your work if you are in an organization or department right now. It's designed to be useful even if you don't have a whole bunch of allies, about guiding movement-centered work, whether you're a philanthropy or whether you're in policy or otherwise. We could start to develop it as a normative framework, maybe something short of a full international doctrine, but something where if we get a number of people around the table who work with this and develop it, we don't think we've found the answer. We think we've started to work on an answer that could be developed further, that could be grounds for collective action, greater coordination, and solidarity between external actors. Or, over time, if it proves its worth, it could develop into some sort of international doctrine with structures that could be developed to go with it. Now, I mentioned that when Peter and I worked on this, we wanted to get this, to have this be not necessarily state-centric, right? So for those who follow atrocity prevention, the prevailing international doctrine of the responsibility to protect, which was used in Libya in 2011, looks like it will never be successfully invoked in the UN Security Council again, at least its most coercive measures. It will not be able to get past a veto. We've seen atrocities since 2011 in Sudan, in Myanmar, in a variety of other places, in Central African Republic, where responsibility to protect has been blocked in the Security Council. So if we're going to do something around a right to assist, we want to get out of the idea that one state can veto and then the whole thing stops. So this requires the designing of different sort of structures to think about how this could be invoked. So let's talk about external support for a second. So what kind of support makes a difference? What can external actors do? To answer this question, we first have to ask, well, what's actually helpful, right? What's going to make a movement more effective? So to come back to my earlier point about skills and strategy, the data is telling us that those matter. And so in our 5-part sort of typology that we offer for supporting movements, the first 2 directly relate to skills and strategy. So the first is simply public education. Make knowledge about civil resistance available, accessible, and attractive to people. We know that if people don't feel like they have a choice, or if people want to rise up, violence can very quickly monopolize the conversation about what needs to happen. If there's a demand for change and violence is the only product on the shelf, people will eventually choose that. So let's make conscious the fact that there is another alternative, that it's more effective, that it's more attractive to most people. A lot of people, the barriers of joining a violent uprising are huge. You basically have to give up your life as you knew it. Whereas in civil resistance, thousands or millions of people can participate and still go home at the end of the day often. So there's much lower barrier to entry. There are a lot of things that are attractive about it. So how can this be communicated? Through a variety of institutions, schools, associations, unions, religious communities, youth clubs. It can different means, television, films, music, art, literature, cultural practices, advertisements. There are lots of ways to just make people aware of this. And messages can be adapted to different languages, history, and cultural context. So I'm not talking about importing something from the outside into various countries. Nonviolent civil resistance is something that is inherent in virtually every culture, right? So I don't know, I have 2 kids. They understand the power of nonviolent dissent. All children do, right? It's something deeper in our human psychology here. It's not something that Gandhi created or that I am talking about as something I put my trademark on. No. Every society has had some version of a strike or a boycott. There is history and cultural practices around disobedience of unjust rule in every single society. But are those elevated in ways that legitimize and hint that, you know, what happened historically is not just a strike or a protest, it's actually part of a much broader method of struggle that we can practice. Public education can also take the form of supporting research about movement effectiveness, which obviously I think it's incredibly important because I'm drawing on it for this work. Supporting the development of new educational resources, films, translations, videos, website, and so forth, curricula. Supporting workshops, supporting online classes, fostering peer-to-peer interaction. This all falls in the category of indirect support. This is not going into another country, trying to pick a particular movement, trying to subversively get stuff into them. This is above the board, available to all comers, just information. The second is capacity building. This is more targeted. This is, in our work at ICNC, we respond to requests from activists around the world. We don't initiate contact, but if they contact us and want something, we try to help them. So if they want it, what can what can external actors provide? Workshops for specific human rights groups and activists on a variety of skills, right? We're going way beyond just the protest here. For movements that want to accomplish legislative gains or major political reforms, they need insider knowledge, access to institutional knowledge. They need, organizing knowledge about how to mobilize a society and a whole range of other things. Change is a team sport. It requires a lot of different skills. So providing workshops, meeting people where they're at, seeing what they need and trying to get that to them. It's very simple. Offering convening space so that people can get together and dialogue. It might sound so simple, but the amount of good ideas that don't get acted on for lack of convening space or because they're missing a few $100s is huge. And people who have suffered under oppression have often been deliberately divided and ruled. So are there spaces that can be brought together intentionally that external actors can provide, where groups can rebuild trust, rebuild social fabric so that they can work together? There is room for small funding and in-kind support and small targeted grants and programs. And this is something I'm more cautious about. It's something that ICNC has done. It's something that I think, when done well, can be incredibly effective. I think providing funds to movements can also be quite risky if not done responsibly, and so maybe we can get into that in the Q&A. It's very useful when done well. There are ways in which it can contaminate a movement or cause all kinds of internal rivalries and squabbling. So it's proceed with caution, but there's a role for it. The third is just supporting populations directly in conflict. Things like offering strike funds, which the United States and European unions did to Poles in the 1980 when they were striking against Soviet rule. Legal aid for persecuted activists. Ensuring adequate medical care for victims of repression, emergency assistance. These are things that are done, and what I'm trying to do is bring them all under a common umbrella of movement support, so that rather than saying each one is legitimately justifiable or exists on its own or has its own community of practice discrete from other communities of practice, we can see that they're synergistic and start acting accordingly and justifying them internationally accordingly, rather than saying, well, this particular form of supports is legitimate, but this one may not be, and we're not focused on that, just this. We need each other, whatever your skill set is. The fourth has to do with increasing the cost of repression. So here, naming and shaming perpetrators. It would be great if there was a new level to this, where if a movement of a certain size was met with violence by its government and it was exercising its rights to engage in nonviolent resistance, if the repression met a certain threshold, say, X number of people who were killed or certain abuses happened, what if that triggered automatic international investigations? So it wasn't a question of who's going to pick up the ball, will that happen? It was known by perpetrators ahead of time. If we do this violence, there will be investigations and targeted sanctions. Attending trials and public actions, diplomats and others do this. Unarmed civilian protection is another thing that can be done, I think remarkably effective, where civilians, both foreign and from the host country, are trained as neutral mediators and de-escalators of conflict. I think we need more research to show just how effective that's been. But all the preliminary, what I've seen is that it is incredibly effective. Back-channel communications. Admiral Dennis Blair wrote a book several years ago in which he said that the US military has so many touch points with other militaries, many of them informal, through exercises, joint exercises, or contacts through war colleges. Why aren't we leveraging those when a movement rises up in another country? If we know the officers in the other country who already have rapport with officers in this country, can we connect them and get them talking? Targeted sanctions, I'm almost done. Lobbying allies to stop supporting oppressive governments. We know this matters. Of course, we ourselves may have to look at our own government's practices as well. Elevating human rights in foreign policy, trade and security policy, possibly cutting off arms shipments. I think generally there is a real need for rebalancing priorities internationally, where trade and security policy don't necessarily always supersede human rights and democracy concerns, and derecognition, which is a separate matter that I won't get into now. But it has to do with a government becoming so egregious that it passes a threshold where it actually gets internationally recognized for its sovereignty. And the fifth, and then I'll stop, has to do with fostering political transitions. Just to be really clear about this is really an if-then thing. This isn't about external actors saying, hey, we'll give you transition support. This is about ordinary people rising up, engaging in civil resistance, meeting violent repression, such that over time they conclude that they actually must change their government. And if and when that happens, the question is, are they left with ad hoc, very little sort of support for that when the government is doing major abuse? Or what can the international community do? So providing pledges of assistance, particularly after transition, which can induce people in the government to think about whether the conditions might be better afterwards. Providing space for oppositions to plan. Again, so simple, but so critical, right? Providing space in the earlier example was about activist strategizing. When there's going to be a political transition, it's more about building structures that can be organized and manage that transition. Election monitoring, protecting whistleblowers and helping to induce whistleblowers from governments that are doing abuse. And then also critically playing a watchdog role post-transition, because that's when gains can be lost. So again, many of these things are done. We see them as related. We see them as something that could fall under right to assist. These are just examples. And one last point I'll make, and then I'd love to hear from the panel, is we actually soon will have research and data to show the effectiveness of a number of these different forms of external support. Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth, we expect over the next 6 months to 9 months, we'll have data that shows publicly the impact that some of these forms of support have had on movements, and that can be a whole additional piece that enriches this conversation. So concerns, considerations, and opportunities. Here's our own self-doubts that we air publicly and questions that might lead into dialogue. What campaign should receive assistance? Peter and I outline 3 different criteria, but there could be more. Is support for civil resistance synonymous with supporting regime change? We answer that, but we know that that's a question people might have. What if external support has a harmful impact on a campaign? What if external support contributes to societal instability? What forms of external support are permissible under international law? And how should R2A be invoked, and who should exercise oversight? Again, we've tried to get into some of that here, but we'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Great. Hardy, thank you so much for that excellent presentation, and warm congratulations to you and to Peter Ackerman for producing a really timely, provocative, well-argumented report. And I can't think of a more important topic to address at a time when, as we've heard, authoritarianism is rising globally, civic space is closing. So thinking about what forms of external assistance to activists and movements can be helpful, I think, is a really, really important topic. So my name is Maria Stephan. I direct the program on nonviolent action here at the Institute, and I have the distinct honor of moderating our panel this afternoon. And we will be hearing from 2 activists and a practitioner who will be essentially reacting to the report into Hardy's presentation and speaking about how, in their experiences, they have kind of the pros and cons of various forms of external assistance and their thoughts on whether there's a right to assist, if you will. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and answer with you all afterwards. So first, Kuskandi Abdel-Shafi is a Sudanese activist, peace and human rights advocate, and an independent research consultant. He was active in the student movement and against genocide and ethnic cleansing in Darfur. And Kuskandi has worked for various organizations to promote human rights and support civil society in Sudan, including the African Center for Justice and Peace Studies and the Sudan Democracy First Group. Next, Alejandra Espinoza is the co-founder of Voices of Nicaragua, an initiative focused on youth and women that promotes a culture of nonviolence, human rights, and social and economic development. When the crisis in Nicaragua first broke out last year, Alejandra managed a victims assistance fund, which guaranteed hospitalization for the injured and funeral expenses for fatalities. Then Ariela Blater is a program officer at Wellspring Philanthropic Fund in the Atrocities Prevention and Response Program. Ariela has worked for over 20 years in policy, strategy, and management in the INGO, multilateral, and private sector as a human rights and humanitarian lawyer. So I think we have an eminently qualified panel to spark the conversation this afternoon. And we're gonna start with Kuskandi, who, as we heard, Sudan has experienced a significant political transition following a popular uprising that removed an accused war criminal from power earlier this year. You were an activist in that movement, and so I wanted to just start by asking you, Kuskandi, what has been your personal experience with external assistance? And if you had to list one or two things that have been helpful and maybe less helpful or even harmful, what would you say?
Thank you, Maria, for a kind introduction, and congratulations, Hardy, and for this great work. I really appreciate it, and this is also my second panel with ICNC for the first report on probability of the atrocity in nonviolent movement. And I am really happy to be here, and thank you for the audience. It's a privilege to come here today. Just a brief introduction. I'm really happy to read this because all of you know Sudan. By nature, this was most dictator and autocrat government in the age of this state called Sudan for the last 60 years. And this because it has combined ethnic elites, autocracy, and also religious ideology, where it always justifies in one of three categories of any activist to be accused of crimes against the state, or extrajudicial killing, or torture, or all kinds of mechanisms that made very hard for any activism to work inside the country. And so because of the war in 2005, the Darfur case was the first case to be submitted to the International Criminal Court in March 2005. And many of Sudanese were hopeful that ICC could at least put a little hope for the international community to act to at least provide justice after they failed to prevent the atrocity at the first place. But this has never happened until today. That is why I'm very happy to read on this approach, because I personally coming from the country which is fragile state where people are continuously living in fear because the state is hostile to them. And I am very happy to read this because it is very hard to see people are killing in the village and you are waiting for that big room, which is the UN Security Council, to take a decision to help rescue people. It's not going to happen. And it failed several times. It fails in Darfur, it fails in South Sudan, it fails in Central Africa, it fails in Myanmar, and it's going to fail. And I think this mechanism provides another alternative on the world not to stop, not with folded hand, that there are things to be done. To get back, before that is like all of you know, Sudan is a living example when you want to see that nonviolent movement works. Our country had 63 years old. In this 63, 52 years were ruled by the military dictators. We have a violent movement start since 1955, which is more than 40 years of the rebel movements that are fighting government. But this is the third time that the nonviolent movement was able to topple the dictator government, and this time, amazingly, was happened by young people aged 10 to 25, but not that. This time was happened by women. And that is why it's a special moment for us to stand and acknowledge that this really practically works, but it also gives more hope, and it's also participatory. Something else that I would like to say is that with my personal, to come back to the question of my personal assistance that we receive, I wouldn't have been here if there is no international assistance. There was a time that I have to leave my country. I was in Ethiopia. I had to leave Ethiopia again. And I was supported by an organization called Eastern Horn African Human Rights Defenders Project, with defending the human rights defender. And they were able to relocate me to Uganda, where I have been safe and where I was managed to come here and be with you all here today. So in personal experience, I have spent in the last 6 to 7 years working on youth movement, using my early experience when I was in university, and also working with an organization that trying to promote democracy. And I think one support that we received a lot of fun, where we provide a youth camp. And when I see these 5 frameworks of assistance, I see that we went through all of this assistance. And I think it was working because one last thing that I remember I was part of was a youth camp where we young people from different parts of Sudan came to plan actual nonviolent resistant action and go back. This was in Kenya, because it was a safe place for them to even build trust, because the government security divides them. And actually, that was in April. In November 27, that was the first time in history of Sudan that successful strike all over the country from east, west, north, and central was occurred in one day. And this was an effective work because of that kind of meticulous planning from different groups, and they were able to take a collective action. And that what really paved the way for these groups to organize themselves and strike new movement that culminated into a regime change. So I am really, I see this practically, this worked in Sudan, but also, and it will work on other places, but talking on Sudan context, we will also see that something that have delayed the nonviolent movement was also from 2005, 2006, 2009, people were more dependent on international intervention. People are thinking, oh, UN Security Council will use Article 7, come back and catch all the criminals and we will have a country free of them. And I think that somehow delayed the process. Also, sometimes something that we also felt, we had a movement in 2009, 2010, and I think in that movement where some of the young people have been received selectively to get out of the country, go somewhere, get trainings, and get some incentives, have created some sort of disagreements among the youth groups. That is why contextual understanding is truly, really important for these frameworks to work. So that's all I could say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kuskandi. And I think he mentioned a number of support options, the Human Rights Defenders Fund, the small grants, the youth training, you know, and the whole idea of waiting for international intervention, you know, not being the case, and so drawing on other resources. So thank you, Kuskandi. Alejandra, the protests that began in Nicaragua last April were met with very harsh repression from both government and paramilitary forces. And the opposition movement is currently demanding free and fair elections. And so I wanted to ask, from your perspective as a Nicaraguan activist, what are the most important things that external actors have done and could do to support a nonviolent, peaceful transition in Nicaragua?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. And this place is an honor to share with all of you. And first, I want to explain how everything start in Nicaragua last late April of last year. Basically, we were two different reasons why the protesters took the streets, especially like the university students and the older adults. The main reason, the first reason was the fire in Indio Maíz. It's a natural reserve, and we were concerned about that fire. And the second one was the government unilaterally reformed the Social Security law, and which basically decreased the benefits for seniors and increased the contributions requirements. And so the citizens and their right to a legitimate right to protest, peaceful protest, they took the streets, and the government responded with violating the basic human rights in Nicaragua. That response resulted in spontaneous, massive, peaceful demonstrations in rural areas and the cities and around the country. And to be clear, I want to just mention that before the April 18 of 2018, we don't have any formal organization and of like a no-violent resistance movement or whatever. It was like a response or one show to support and assist and with a solidarity with victims of the repression, and with a strong commitment and conviction that the violence will never be justified in Nicaragua. I think that's the most important thing. Now we have 300 people killed, 100 people in jail as a political prisoners, thousands people injured, and like a political and socioeconomic crisis that we are living right now. I think the international community react pretty quickly, condemning the repression, like the human rights violations in a miracle time, I can say that. For example, in just 90 days, we have the OAS condemning the repression, and they create in real time during the repression. They create a special group, a working group at the OAS to follow up what's going on in Nicaragua, and they travel to Nicaragua in those days. The international community react, like each government react condemning the human rights violations. And the other thing is, as a citizen with some privilege, to be honest, we mobilize each other to support victims of the repression, no matter what, if they were on the street or what they were doing. It was just a humanitarian support when the government started to deny the attention in public hospitals. That was something that really moved us, to support all these people. And to be honest, we cannot wait until the international community react to support peaceful protesters. And people with privilege, we have to support them. We have, even when we are not involved in their demands, if someone is dying, if someone is denied the attention to peaceful protesters, or everyone, we have to support them. And one incredible thing that happened was when the government started to criminalize the protesters, and the repression increased, many people fled the country and they start to walk to Costa Rica. And one important gesture of humanitarian support, the Costa Rica, they opened the borders, and they support, or they increase the whole migration process. Of they improve their own migration process to asylum seekers. That's really important thing. And one thing really happened was just in 5 months we have this at the UN, the the Security Council, and now it's in the OAS hands that we have to trying to solve all this crisis. Unfortunately, many countries, the majority of the countries, are really concerned about what's going on in Nicaragua, and how everything are being happening right now. And the other thing is one important thing that happened is before the crisis, we don't have enough support from the international community, or we don't have support in civic engagement or participation and or democracy values or all this stuff. But the small organizations who has been working underground, when the crisis start, they just start to support the NGOs or the activists or leaders that they met before the crisis. And I think it's really important to, in those kind of situations, have keep the connections with people on the ground, and whenever something happens, you can connect with them immediately, or you can and they will tell you what's really need in that moment. We don't need to invite what the country needs. As a movement, we know what can we do. And for example, since April 18 of 2018, we have many strikes, marches, vigils, and many things that were happening, not just in Nicaragua, around the world, condemning the repression. But we need a lot of tools and new tools in the international community to support people in real time. I think save lives is the most important thing. No matter what, if they were in one side or another side, we need to save lives.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. Those are really important messages. And you also got, interestingly, at how outside actors can help prevent and mitigate repression through condemning violence and other means. So thank you very much. And finally, Ariella, so from your perspective as both an international legal expert and a philanthropist, how does the right to assist resonate with you based on what you've heard from the panelists and from the report that you read?
Okay, I got the first hurdle is I got the microphone on. Thank you. I just want to thank again Maria for your underlying research and for moderating today, Hardy, Peter for the report, and the interesting merging of sort of this social science, political science approach with what I feel is sort of the field that I work in, the mass atrocity prevention field. And so my reflections kind of round out things with that lens as to how this progresses the sort of mass atrocity frame. Does it cause harm? Does it hinder progress there? And in that vein, I was very interested and thank my colleagues here on the panel. It's interesting, Maria, that you called me a practitioner, because I would say that's the last thing in comparison that I am. Really, these are the practical examples that in my recent 2 years ago switch to philanthropy, the intention is to support these. So my first just general reflection here was that it's interesting that this report has used the responsibility to protect frame, something really akin to the norm setting in the mass atrocity space. But the question that arises for me is this really a right or a responsibility? And almost in the report, right off the bat, I would say, Peter and Hardy, you did a great job of restating the case that this is absolutely a right. There's absolutely no prohibition that I can think of on it. And similarly, we do have a responsibility to support these nonviolent means of achieving these democratic gains. and that we shouldn't really necessarily think about the responsibility to protect frame, because it almost brings us back to that let's seek sovereignty, let's get this back into the inactivity among states, and let's get back into that, sovereignty and non-intervention principle. So I would say that this is a strong principle, and that I see it as a responsibility, and it is absolutely a right. So that being said, I think the key question that I'm reflecting on is, as an external actor, how can an external actor like the private foundation space that I occupy be helpful as opposed to a hindrance? And I first think that I want to commend the authors for also recognizing there's so much more research to be done about this. We're all flying by the seat of our pants. We, in many ways, have no idea what we're doing, particularly in the private philanthropy space. And I'm, again, speaking from my personal philanthropic funder lens as opposed to my foundation in particular. So in terms of that, I think there's two sides of this. Do we help or hinder in this sort of external support? Do we help or harm the movement itself? And do we as external actors help or harm in reducing mass atrocities? And those are not necessarily the same thing. On the movement space, I would say that a foundation like my own and many others understand that locally grown movements and locally led engagements are important and lead to durable peace. That being said, we don't necessarily understand when, why, or how, and I think that's really important. And we certainly do not know how to fund those authentically in a way that does not change the purpose or shield from safeguard against repression. And in general, it's no mystery that foundations have their own strategy, goals, and outcomes. And here, Hardy, you've made the very good point that it is important for these movements to authentically rise up to achieve their aims. That's by nature at odds with the timetable and the outcomes and the process of which a foundation goes through. So those are sort of limiting factors. So that means that the needs that are identified have to be authentic from the ground, and they have to be met immediately in, as Alejandra put, at the moment in response, and that has to meet together. And I think that rarely takes place. And so I think another area that the report could continue to develop is these experiences of how there are small funds, emergency opportunities, small targeted pots of money that can actually make a difference. I'm happy to say that my particular foundation has a rapid response emergency fund that puts small funds into the hands of people. We strive to get to the point in time where we can do something as small as gas money, because the other thing is the model, the foundation model, is very specific of a certain amount of money to a certain legal framework of charitable status, of certain reporting requirements. And that is at odds with the mutual purpose. So before you invite these external actors and take their resources, understand that your different desires and process are already at odds, and you need to line that up. The second thing, excuse me, here is that do external actors help in the mass atrocity space? Does their entry assist with and support those endeavors which are intended to put an end to the ongoing or the threat of mass atrocities? Here we know a lot more about the extreme form of mass atrocities, of genocides, and interestingly enough, in most cases, the outside support does not help. And unfortunately, in most cases, the genocide is either completed, the act is done to completion, or internal force is used. And where it is unclear, if anything, that it is prolonged or not by external actors. So then when it comes to the general mass atrocities, there's so much we don't know. It's so context specific. And in general, I think here, again, it invites that question for more research. If we're saying that we want to support movements, and in that process, we want to stop or mitigate atrocities, we need to understand the invitation of those external actors comes with risk and not necessarily a positive return. The other thing I wanted to say is, excuse me, referencing off of my other, colleagues here, I think, and the report, I think Hardy and Maria's underlying research and Peter make a really strong case for how nonviolent means are effective, can prolong can protect, engage in create a secure space, mitigate violence, and I think that it's really important to also recognize that women in leadership roles in nonviolent movements are doubly as effective. I don't know what that number value would be, but in the mass atrocity space, I've seen a lot of great research about elevating women's leadership in all forms of the spectrum of peace building. Whether it be in the response or the prevention side, and by extrapolation, and we see some research outside on the table. So I wonder if there can be another dimension to this about how effective nonviolent movements are when women are in leadership and it's indigenous locally.
Thank you so much, Ariella. That was super helpful. And you know, thank you for the words of caution as well, and kind of the starting point of do no harm, and recognizing kind of the risks associated with outside support, which are incredibly important for those on the outside to consider when it comes to external support. So we've got about 15 minutes that remain, so I think we should go directly to discussion with the audience, and maybe what I'll do is take 2 or 3 at a time, and we'll see how many rounds we can get through. So all the way in the back, please. And let's, you'll probably need a mic, so there we go. Thank you.
Thank you. And I particularly appreciated this.
Oh, maybe just say your name and affiliation and brief question. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Simon Billanes, and I'm with the International Campaign for the Rohingya, and also campaign director of No Business with Genocide. And we really operate in the space, I mean, just to pull back a little bit, I mean, this unified field theory of assisting nonviolent movements, I mean, this was fascinating. I think it's groundbreaking work. And what interests me particularly is, you know, where we fit into this, which is, you know, increasing the cost of repression. Because, you know, we've been focusing on, you know, sanctioning bad actors through citizen sanctions, in the case of Burma and the Rohingya. And we put pressure on Chevron to adopt a policy of not doing business with governments engaged in genocide or crimes against humanity. And in response to that, they have publicly said that they are raising human rights issues with the government of Myanmar. And we've been doing this also with other oil companies like Total, even the Chinese National Overseas Oil Corporation, which is also publicly traded. So I'm particularly interested in, because this is how you know, nonviolent movements here in the US, just like during the campaign against apartheid, kind of linked hands with nonviolent campaigns in South Africa and sort of turned around US policy from support for the apartheid regime and corporate investment in South Africa to divestment and US sanctions. So, you know, I'd be very interested in, you know, talking further and further discussion on how, you know, through tools like this, by focusing on the fact that these governments committing this oppression want and need foreign investment. And if we put pressure on companies to not invest or not trade, if that government crosses certain lines, certain red lines, you know, we've got another extra tool that's part of this unified field theory of tools in terms of external support.
Thank you very much. Up here, please.
My name is Effie Tembon with Oasis Network. From Cameroon, I'm going to be speaking from that backdrop because of an ongoing horrific atrocities in Cameroon. I very much appreciate the presentation. It's very rich, a lot of things that I've learned today from this. And I appreciate the fact that we're looking at overcoming the present challenges, especially with the responsibility to protect. Because we've come face to face, it looks like a very concrete wall trying to find solutions with what's going on. The question I have is, what practical ways do we have in terms of not just you talked about naming and shaming, but we have actors in the Western world that put economic priorities above human rights. They'll hire lobbyists, big muscles, to block the media from covering what's going on. Political leaders will be cozy with dictators how do you go about those challenges that are real challenges?
Great question. So why don't we go to the back here?
Thanks so much. My name is Noah Rosen. I'm a PhD student at American University. My question is about how does this R2A framework that you've created travel to Civil War contexts, given the statistic that Hardy shared with us, that 2/3 of atrocities happen in civil wars? And I'm especially thinking of the kind of nonviolent strategies that people like Ali Kaplan and Arjona and others have talked about in terms of active neutrality, other nonviolent strategies for violence prevention. What is the effectiveness of nonviolent strategies in Civil War contexts? Do the same kind of external support mechanisms that you discussed apply to those kind of more localized movements against non-state actors often? And what are some of the links that you see between these kind of local actions for violence prevention with nonviolent movements for more general social change? Thank you.
Those are great questions. And since we're short for time, why don't we take one more question from right up here?
Hi, Ursula with Friends Committee on National Legislation, and I just had a quick question about the international support. We're talking so far about benevolent international support, but for example, in Sudan, right after the coup, we saw Saudi and other Gulf partners flood money in to protect the military leadership that had taken over rather than push for a democratic transition. So what's the international community's role in sort of countering those not so benevolent international actors?
Okay, those were meaty questions. So we have the foreign investment corporations question, how to address things like lobbyist pressure and like preventing media and journalists from entering these conflict areas. How well does this framework travel to civil wars, and nefarious outside support and how that can be countered. So, go.
I got 4 pages of notes.
Just maybe take one that's pressing, and we'll make sure we get everyone has a voice.
Sure. First of all, I'll respond to you, Simon. Thank you for sharing that example and your valuable work. You know, this is a great example of things we missed. And
Hardy, just be sure to.
oh, sure. Thank you for your comment and for your valuable work. It's a great example of things we missed and could have put in the report and you know, should be included next time as an example of international support. I would point out that one split that we often see in governments that are doing abuse is a split between actors who primarily think of their interests at the bottom line as economic interests versus political interests. And what a civil resistance movement can do, whether domestic or external civil resistance or both, is split those interests where one says, ultimately, my highest value is getting back to business as usual and profitability, and the other says, ultimately, our highest value is maintaining control no matter what. And when the economic and political start to split, it can lead to cascading effects. So I see what you're doing is very valuable, and in that frame, which I think should be built out. I'll stop there and reserve my right maybe to say something later.
Any other responses to that?
I had one response. Thank you, Ursula, for your point, and I think I have no great answer except that this is opening the Pandora's box. And so if you were to maintain this as a doctrine, then it is not restrictive to benevolent support. And so, and it would similarly have no restriction. If we had such restriction, then we would find ourselves in a position to not have that right to assist. So I think it's a really important point for Peter and Hardy to consider as they continue to ally this to a doctrine. With the benevolent support.
Hardy, why don't you respond to that?
I'll respond to that as well. So it's funny, you know, I always bring more slides in a presentation than I have time to make. And so 2 of my slides relate directly to what you're talking about, because we know after the Sudanese interim, I forget the exact acronym for it, met with UAE and Saudi. They launched a lot of repression, and also when the airport was shut down due to strikes, Egypt said, you know what, we'll give you workers to reactivate your critical infrastructure. So what is this? This is authoritarians that have really for the last 15 years or more become much more deliberate and coordinated in challenging and becoming more effective at suppressing nonviolent movements. It's very deliberate. It's been building for a long time. I would say it correlates quite well with the decline in democracy overall in the world, which is documented over 13 years. So, in other words, when a movement rises up now in a place like Sudan, it is facing the local government and numerous other governments that want to work directly to mitigate the economic, political, or social impacts that that movement has. Oh, did a strike shut down your infrastructure? We'll help you. Are they imposing costs in your economy? We'll help. So we've seen this, and I guess, this is a really critical point to elevate. On the other side, who has movements' backs? Is there coordination? At what level? This is what has been lacking. So part of how we can see right to assist, we made the case here that it has a significant role to play in preventing atrocities and violent conflict. It can also be construed to have a role to play in creating more global stability around, stemming the decline of democracy and stemming the expansion of authoritarianism, because external actors that support human rights and democracy have not been as organized, I would say, in the last 15 years as those that are seeking to stamp it out and particularly target movements. So I see what you're saying. Consistent with that, I also would say, yes, you open up right to assist and you say external support is legitimate, and then various governments say, well, how about this support? How about that support? And want to use it for their own purposes. We know that will happen. Criteria are very important. That's something we hit on a lot in this report about what are the criteria for evaluating a movement's impact. And this is all stuff that has to be developed, and then mechanisms need to be enforced when countries abuse it.
Right, thanks, Hardy. I'm brought back to Fletcher School, like international law classes, and then it's like, who decides in these cases? But anyhow, Alejandra.
Yes, I would like to answer the question about the lobbies in the media. In our case, unfortunately, we are like a small country, and after months, nobody cares about what's going on in Nicaragua. And we are just 6 million people, Nicaraguans. And sometimes it's not just someone who is trying to quit the topic in the media. It's just we as a citizens we are forgetting what's going on in some countries, especially when the governments or big enterprises doesn't have any economic interest in those kind of countries. For that reason, as citizens, for us, it's really important to keep that in the agenda in different countries, in our country as well, because sometimes the people just want to continue their lives, because it's really hard if you think the whole atrocities, the way commitment it's really hard to keep it. And the most important thing to keep it in the agenda in the international community for me is the transition, for the transitional justice in wars or human rights violations. We can use that tool, and in our case, we should explore how can we use the transitional justice, because it's not just we cannot get in those kind of a situation. We cannot just work on electoral system or democratic system or rule of law. We have to work on justice. We are having all this pain in the society. We have a traumatized society, and no matter what side you were during the repression, and the other thing is the type of repression change. And sometimes it doesn't mean that we are not seeing people on the street, dying on the street. It doesn't mean that the repression is not continue. We have to find or recognize the way that how the repression continues. And one thing is not just, for me, it's not just the right to assist or to protect. We have, as a countries, we have the obligation to support peaceful transitions. For me, it's something that is it's not something that it's happening in that country. It's something that's happening around the world, and impact in the whole in the whole region. In this case, in Central America, and one thing for me really important is use the technology that we have now to and the expertise, the international expertise, we need to recover the confidence in governments, in rule of law, and like easy things that we need to like recover that confidence.
Great. Thanks, Alejandra. So Kuskanda, you have the final word. We've got about a minute left.
Okay. Thank you for a very good questions. I will just only react with Ursula's question on spoilers, which we call. So there is not only local spoilers, there is always international spoilers, and they come in different ways, either autocratic relations or economic relations. And I think that is something that the framework could have some kind of a way to deal with that, with regard to dealing with those spoilers, and which happens in Sudan case, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt. But also something else that I would also want to say about the nonviolent movement in war context. I think after the spark of nonviolent movement all over the Sudan, and even before that, in Darfur there was always being a nonviolent movement in the IDP camps. So there is a larger IDP camp which are almost a liberated area. There's nobody from the government could ever enter because of the resistance of the people. And I think there is always, whatever the situation, there is a way that nonviolent movement was work. Also, for instance, when the nonviolent movement started, for instance, we have a lot of large China investments in Sudan. So the youth went to Chinese embassy. For 3 days, they speak Chinese. These are like students who are professional Chinese language speakers. They wrote banners. They spend there for 2 days shouting and yelling at them. And I think that has somehow an effect. Just to finally wrap up, also I would like to say there is also other type of support. For instance, in Sudan case, there is a very well organized professional Sudanese diaspora that played a very crucial role in the change that happens. And I don't know within this framework where this fall out, but it is a very important and crucial. Something else also to think about, there is a kind of when the movement starts in Sudan, there is other protests in different countries. For instance, in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa supporting people in Sudan. In Nairobi, Kenya, those has a very strong meaning also to the movement inside, where we'll see and this also happens when the Kenyan protest the second election. You will find the Ugandan opposition making a protest supporting Baba which is in Kenya, and I think there is always this kind of particular country which has popular connections, social connections. I think those kind of support also have a lot of meaning in encouraging people to continue, but also it put a lot of pressure, diplomatic pressure from their government to act in favor, and that's why there is a lot of other frameworks that are very useful. For instance, something that helped Sudan was the derecognition of the African Union to the Transitional Military Council, a strong statement and condemnation from the U.S. government, European Union, and UN Security Council later. This was like the good things that I could ever remember from the UN Security Council and African Union. So I think those are like kind of things that happen. But one general thing, just for final to say, is that the framework always, I feel like it starts when already there is a movement, and then the support comes in. And I think we can think about how all the development fund and peace-building programs have really anchored from the beginning on building self-sustained society. Anchoring with this could help in having these organic, locally built movements. And that's like, for instance, thinking about exit strategy. If I have $5 million project in a country or in a community for 3 years, I should from the beginning start when I am getting out, what I'm going to leave. one of the things I could have organized a community, and that's where you will spend some of the funding for doing that. And I think that will help to have, and there is the UN resolution on peace building architecture, which provide a lot of good things on what really international framework could support on this process. So that's all I can say, but I am optimistic, and thank you.
Oh, thank you, Kuskandi. So I wanted to formally thank, again, Hardy Merriman for co-authoring an awesome report, and Peter Ackerman, and thank you to our panelists for really, supporting an enlightening conversation this afternoon. I sense this is the beginning of a much longer conversation that certainly we'll continue to support at the Institute. So thank you all for coming out, and I hope you all can escape the rain getting back home. Thank you.
My question, of course.